we've gone through several themes today. One of the themes we've gone through is what is the issue of consciousness? What are the big ticket issues we're looking at? That was one of the themes. What are the big tickets? What's the big picture from a point of view of microtubulars and neurology, a point of view of metaphysics, epistemology? We want to go through what's the big picture? What are the questions? What questions, as Martin Fleming pointed out, should we be asking? What would research look like if consciousness was its own entity to look at? Then we looked at examples of folks looking, what areas might you develop into research? And I realize some of this is very early in process, and it hasn't reached its maturation yet it gives so much room for thought. Now we're moving on to a very important session, and the next speaker we have is, even though it's near the end of the day, there's a reason for that. It's probably one of the most important talks we're going to hear today. And the general topic is relevance, communication, and public perception. I was having lunch with Dr. Hameroff, and we were discussing the problem of artificial intelligence. There was a time when the metaphor was the telegraph, then the telephone, and then finally the computer. When all of these networks get together, it emulates what consciousness is. And in each generation, the sci-fi movies came out with first the telegrams, the telegraph or the telephone would all get together and start talking to each other and take over the world. And that metaphor is still present, but now it's gone the supercomputer, the artificial intelligence. As Dr. Hameroff demonstrated last night, not even close, and as other speakers have demonstrated, not even possible. And Dr. Hameroff made a major breakthrough, and he is not welcome at artificial intelligence conferences for that reason. Not at all. And he was telling me how he went to Stanford to speak, and there was a protester. So that is a compliment, and he saw it that way. So now we come to the point of a conference, very important. How do we communicate with the world, with folks, that maybe consciousness has to be looked at differently? It's relevant for scientists. That's how you get grants. Templeton now is giving a grant to explore consciousness. It's relevant in science departments. If you want to look at it, we want to look at it with a different paradigm. It's relevant in our everyday life. But how do you have this dialogue between spirituality, sometimes between metaphysics and the physicalist world? As Dr. Resnick spoke about this morning, it's a complex issue. And metaphysics, if we're talking to non-philosophers about metaphysics, it's difficult. So how do we communicate concepts? So this session will talk about that. Now, our first speaker has come all the way from a long, long way, and that is Tom Aechtner. Tom has come, he's a Canadian, which is what I tell people nowadays if they ask where I'm from. But, and he might really be an American and just said he's Canadian too. We don't know that yet, but we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt of being a Canadian who's at the University of Queensland. He's a senior lecturer in religion and science, which is so relevant. His interests is focus on mainly religious-motivated vaccine hesitancies, especially in Africa, where there's a religious push not to do vaccines for religious reasons, but for the science says you darn well better do it. He's working on a project of improving vaccination rates in Australia, analyzing media, religion, and policy. He's really quite an expert on these topics. So it's really going to be one of our most important lectures. I'd like everyone to give it their maximum attention. I'm going to talk about the other speakers. Next speaker he's going to have will be his student, Oliver Zambon. Oliver is a graduate student doing his PhD under Tom in similar areas. And then we're going to have Stuart Kreitzer speaking. Now, Stuart's a cool guy. I went to his dissertation defense, and the chair said, best she ever heard. But he can present it in the folksiest of ways. So you're going to enjoy his talk. And just to get the right title here, he's going to be speaking on Foundations of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. He's done, the Institute's sponsoring this. Why are we doing this? What are our foundations? And all of us scientists in the Institute are standing on the shoulders of our late colleague, Richard Thompson, who was a giant. So if we look tall, it's because we're on his shoulders. And his books are out there. He's done so many books, so many great intellectual pursuits, and the archivist of that is Stuart. So we'll begin with Tom Aechtner speaking on enhancing religious science communication. Stuart's going to go on the foundations of the Institute. Oliver Zambon's going to do Vaishnavism, anti-evolution, and ambiguities, revisiting ISKCON's own dilemma of just talking about evolution. And both Tom and Oliver have just published a major article in one of the most major journals, Zygon, a very, very significant piece of work. And finally, we're going to have Ravi Gupta speak on, can empirical observation influence scriptural testimony? And he's going to reference that with works from Jiva Goswami. Now, Ravi is an interesting person. He went to college, I think he was 12 years old. He started college, graduated by 15, went on to Oxford, one of the youngest people there ever to get a PhD. But then he decided he'd get married so it'd keep him humble. His resume is extremely impressive. It goes on for pages and pages. Right now, he's in Department of History and Religion, if I have it right, in Utah. Excuse me? You're head of the department. Utah State University, and you're head of the department. Director of Religious Studies. Congratulations. Okay, and so that's after the talks. Then we're going to have again a panel discussion. Again, we ask you to fill out a card, or if you don't have a card, we can call on you and repeat the question. We'll have a few questions. After that, we're going to have a dinner, because conferences make us all hungry. After the dinner, for those who still have stamina, I'll repeat the announcements later. We're going to have some book signings in the corner there. We're going to have a little musical interlude on the piano. We're going to have a poster session in room 105 for some who couldn't make it, wanted to present. We're going to have some movies showing, and I'm going to talk about the movies later on just at the break time. And one of the movies will be Brenda Dunn's Peer Project. We're going to Pair. We're going to be showing that. We're going to be showing an award-winning movie on the Yamuna River and we'll talk a little more about that. Tomorrow afternoon, Brenda has appointments tomorrow morning, for those who know, a meeting with Mickey Singer. And then she's going to come back in the afternoon if we don't wear her out too much. And we're going to add some breakout discussion. We'll add it to the schedule because a lot of people have said, I got to understand, what's this PAIR project about? I mean, I've been fascinated by it since I first heard about it 15 years ago. And so that's our schedule for the day. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom.
All right. How you doing? All right. I am Canadian, Bob. An actual Canadian. Well, look, I just thought I'd start by formally thanking Bob and his team. You guys have been great hosts. Last year when Bob emailed me about this conference, invited me to this conference, it was in relation to that paper that Oliver and I published last year. And when I received the invitation, my first thought was that Bob hadn't calculated the risks of inviting me here. Firstly, because the heavy lifting, the real research heavy lifting on that project was done by Oliver, not by myself, so he'll be presenting on that. And the second reason was that I've never published anything to do with consciousness. Never had any research area at all related to consciousness, still haven't, and don't plan on it. So there's that issue. So now you're wondering why I'm here. Anyway, in the email that I sent back to Bob, I said this, quote, I worry that my research area may have little to offer towards the conference goals of investigating consciousness. And I said, I fear in the end that I will have wasted your time, which is not something I'd be keen on doing, which is a Canadian way of saying thanks but no thanks. In the end, Bob's response, if I'm paraphrasing, was, sounds great. Love to have you. So I was like, I have nothing to do with this conference at all. Don't think I can come. Wonderful. Love to have you. And so, you know, as is common, I think, with me, that caused a moment of awkwardness, as I feel right now, as you're contemplating why you're here listening to me. And as I'm apt to do in moments of awkwardness is that I babble and tell odd stories. So here's one. A few weeks ago in Australia, I went to see a movie with a good friend of mine. As we're wont to do, we see whatever superhero movie's coming out. There was one coming out. And he invited a number of his friends that I didn't know to watch the movie with us. And as we were waiting in line to buy our tickets and head into the theater, you know, the inevitable sorts of questions were asked among this group. You know, how was your day? What have you been up to? And then there's the question of, to me, what do you do for a living? And that's a question that I sometimes hesitate to answer, especially when I'm talking to people of religious faith, in fact, of which I am, by the way. But the reason that I'm sometimes tentative about this question is because my research has largely been focused on studying the persuasion media tactics of anti-evolutionists, so people opposed to evolutionary theory, as well as media tactics of pro-evolutionists, those actively trying to support evolutionary theory to the public. And a central question that I've sought to answer in my work is why people are skeptical of well-established consensus science, such as the theory of biological evolution or the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And that's where the problem lies when I'm in a movie theater talking to people I've never met before. Because when I get asked about my work on public transit or at the theater or in whatever community group, problems tend to arise. And it's because many people that I meet happen to be skeptical of evolution, or they're skeptical of anthropogenic climate change, or they're skeptical about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, which is also one of my research areas. So when people find out what I research, it is sometimes the case that it ends conversations rather abruptly, You know, so it's kind of like, what do you do? And then it's like, oh. Or it sparks up rather aggressive conversations, more often than not when I'm talking to other people of religious faith, frequently with people associated with my own Christian tradition. And these conversations can be interrogative, kind of testing where I stand on issues. Like, so what do you really think about this and that? And in the case of being at the movies that day, a few weeks ago, one of the individuals that I met that night continued to ask me about my work. And that's, again, usually done sort of askance, like, what do you do? It was side glances. Really? And you're married? You know, this. And then he just came out with it that night before we went into the movies, and he said, do you study and accept the false science of evolution? And often from there, people start to pitch questions regarding what they think are knockdown arguments against evolutionary theory. And that's the type of response I've become accustomed to receiving since I was an undergrad studying biological evolution at the University of Alberta 20 years ago, to present to the present day when I go to local churches or I meet people in the community for the first time. University of Alberta, Jonathan Banks, shout out. Oh yeah. And if I'm honest, I have skepticism fatigue. So I'm in a state of skepticism fatigue as I receive these sorts of reactions on a daily basis, on airplanes, in fact, flying to Florida. But I suspect that many of you might actually be asking the same sorts of questions regarding evolutionary theory that people ask me, or have skeptical views about consensus science, such as evolutionary theory. And at the same time, perhaps there are some of you here today who work in the sciences, or who have had scientific training, who potentially are less decided on evolutionary theory. And maybe there's some of you that are quite convinced of the empirical basis and explanatory power of biological evolution, but aren't yet sure how to best raise the topic or discuss evolutionary theory with your friends or colleagues who may be opposed to it. Look, whatever your opinion about evolutionary theory might be, I will say from the outset that I respect your intellectual capacities. And it's my hope that no matter what your attitudes towards consensus science are, that you will be able to gain something from this presentation today. So as I noted, much of my work has been dedicated to studying Darwin's skeptic mass media and the goal of delineating the sorts of persuasive tactics that can be identified in Christian young earth creationist, as well as intelligent design theory media. Well, I've also looked at the aspects of Islamic creationist claims and new atheist arguments for evolution that are used against religion, as well as religious pro-evolutionist communications. And just to give you, the quick and dirty introduction, I'll just throw up a graph there to demonstrate my credibility. My work uses the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, which is presented visually here. And it's generally considered the most accepted model for describing how people are persuaded via communications. And look, all that you really need to know is that there are two avenues that are described that are part of this persuasion technique. So there's the central route, the central processing route, and through that avenue of persuasion, a person is faced with a persuasive communication and critically analyzes it and deconstructs it and looks at every piece of the argument and then makes a decision one way or the other. The other route, however, is called the peripheral route of persuasion, and as it turns out, this is the route that we follow most of the time. And with the peripheral route of persuasion, we tend to rely on heuristics, on peripheral cues, to make a quick decision regarding the persuasive communication. So does the person have a degree from a prestigious university? Well, maybe then I can trust them. Is this person wearing a lab coat? These sorts of things. And while, ideally we'd all like to think that we follow the central route of persuasion, most researchers have found that we just don't have the motivation or the time or, let's say, the ability. We're not always educated in every topic that we're presented with. Most of us many people don't know how an internal combustion engine works, and yet we make decisions about cars, without understanding the full science and engineering behind vehicles. So we make these decisions based on, price and make and model and these sorts of things. So in the end, we often follow the peripheral route of persuasion. And so my research looked at peripheral cues that have been identified for decades now that tend to function within this elaboration likelihood model and tend to convince people, and they can function peripherally, and sometimes these cues then also spark central root processing. And my work has looked at these 13 persuasive cues in mass media, in what I call evolution wars mass media. So looking at things like arousal of fear, asking questions, and so here I'll just give you a very brief primer on some of these cues, which are quite recurrent and that I identify. So some of these include source cues, so messenger credibility, right? So is the person claiming to have prestigious degrees from significant, and there's been a number of studies, by the way, done on messenger credibility. I tell my undergrad students about these. So, you get a group of students into a classroom, 200 students, and you get the same person presents a topic on a particular, something relevant to the students, maybe. Those students leave, and the same person gives this talk to another 200 students, but in one case, the person is described as having, a degree from a very prestigious university, and in the other case, the exact same individual giving the exact same speech does not have any prestigious degrees. And of course, the people are significantly more persuaded by that same individual when he has prestigious degrees. Incidentally, if it's a male, they also interpret that person as being taller. So after the fact, they say, oh, this guy from Harvard, yeah, he was 6'1". And then the first time, he had a master's degree from University of Queensland. Yeah, he was like 5'10", these sorts of things. So I'm like 6'7". And that's messenger credibility, and then we get source attraction. This is where we have, someone, a celebrity, for instance, may increase appeal of a product, or if a person shares the same values as you, that tends to attract people. Even if the person, by the way, has the same name as you tend to be more amenable to what that person is selling. So be cautious about that. Asking questions, so asking intention questions, for instance, asking what a person intends to do in the future tends to trigger a response that they're more likely to respond and then follow through with that prediction. So they're more likely to over-predict what they're going to do and then follow through. And then rhetorical questions, of course, the use of rhetorical questions in advertising. Contrast principle, negativity effect. This is just simply the case that the characteristics of one item are accentuated much more if they're compared with another item, right? So this is just in fact, contrast advertising has been found to be so effective that it is often regulated or illegal in many countries because it tends to be so. This is where we get before and after pictures, right? You're much more likely to be convinced by before and after picture than if you just saw one picture. And the negativity effect I attach to this, and this is that negative information tends to be much more salient or memorable or influential than is positive information. Social consensus, this is just the idea. This is playing upon a majority of people. So you say, you don't need to convince people that an idea is correct, you just need to convince people that a majority of people believe that the idea is correct, and that can be often quite persuasive. And then there's that social proof or multiple sources, and then we get underdog effects. There's a little bit of a reversal of that, is you can actually persuade people by not convincing that a majority of people are behind a position, but that a valiant minority is behind a certain position. Statistics and technical jargon. This is one thing that the cosmetic industry has been selling and using for years and years. Just the use of statistics and technical jargon tends to indicate expertise to people. So when you throw up statistics, this many people do this many people do that, most people lack the numeracy to understand what statistics actually mean. And so they use statistics as an indicator of expertise, and then they look for the person's messenger credibility. Same with technical jargon. Here are two others. The scarcity principle. So we tend to judge the value of a product by its availability, right? And as the availability decreases, we tend to increase heuristically the value of that product. And likewise, censorship tends to increase people's interest in ideas. So if I say to you, oh, look, I've got this great paper in Zygon, You're thinking, who cares? And I said, I got this great paper in Zygon, and the Australian government is censoring it. Your interest in what I'm selling is now increased. And then message repetition. Message repetition is a bit of a tricky one, but it tends to work. In any case, look, this is some of my, see, I am an expert. Numbers. Lots of numbers. All you need to know from this, just summing it up, is that when I looked at anti-evolutionist mass media in contrast with pro-evolutionist mass media, anti-evolutionist mass media tends to use a wider array of persuasive cues and more nuanced use of persuasive cues than are pro-evolutionists, right? So there tends to be a much more nuanced use of persuasive elements. And having analyzed these persuasive techniques, a question that I've now been frequently asked in one form or another has been, what might your research tell us about how we can better advocate for consensus science in the face of science-skeptical and specifically anti-evolutionist influences? And because I get interrogated so often in my day-to-day life, it's a question that I am seeking to answer for myself as well. I get asked about this quite a bit in movie theaters and in day-to-day life. How do we better respond to these sorts of things? And partly I'm asking this because, if I'm honest, I've not always answered people opposed to evolution in ways that are particularly profitable or beneficial. So I'm not always haven't been perhaps a polite enough Canadian. Now, in response to this inquiry, I have at most conveyed, and this is in one of my papers, that aspiring to counter Darwin skepticism, those that are trying to aspire to counter Darwin skepticism must acknowledge that anti-evolutionist media tends to harness a broader and more ubiquitous suite of persuasion techniques than does media supportive of evolutionary theory. So all I've said is, look, if you're a pro-evolutionist, you're interested in advocating for evolutionary theory, you should consider how persuasive heuristic cues can be effectively used for the promotion of biological sciences. And I've been reluctant to provide further advice for at least two reasons. The chief of these is that my analysis of evolution wars mass media has intentionally been a non-normative exercise. So that is the goal of my work, has been to systematically describe persuasive attributes and conceptualize implications of media influences, but rather than to prescribe what optimal actions should be taken by, let's say, pro-evolutionist stakeholders. The research I have presented so far has also not directly measured effects of media persuasion. So I have also not gone and directly empirically measured what kind of effects these are having, but instead I've just simply reported on persuasive features that interleave anti-evolutionist and pro-evolutionist communications. And the second reason that I've been cautious about saying anything includes ethical considerations of endorsing a persuasion agenda, right? So we may know that people can be persuaded by appealing to expertise or common values, just because we know that it could be argued that this knowledge does not necessarily justify the use of such techniques. So look, with regard to this, I'll just quickly say that the aims of media persuasion can be both ethically innocuous as well as sinister. So if an organization or government produces mass persuasive media engineered for improving the overall public good, such as combating drunk driving or curbing domestic violence, this may be conceived as a form of prescribed persuasion, which does not necessarily exemplify negative intent or evil tactics. And this is sometimes called public interest communications. But that is still a difficult topic, the ethics of me possibly prescribing a persuasive approach for trying to promote consensus science. But anyway, turning back to the difficulties of shifting from non-normative research to normative ventures, while my work has measured persuasion cue occurrences, it does not empirically test media effects such as heuristics upon selected audiences, though there are a legion of persuasion research and marketing lessons that point to the effectiveness of such persuasion approaches. At the same time, it is possible to look beyond my own analyses to a growing corpus of pro-science intervention research associated with endorsing scientific notions to doubting audiences. So in particular, vaccination hesitancies have received substantial attention because of the prospective influences of anti-vaccination pundits and the immediate public health repercussions associated with immunization refusal. So just the other day, the WHO released a list of the top 10 most global health threats, and they listed vaccine hesitancies on this top 10 list. So studies into offsetting vaccine hesitancies provide valuable insights concerning kind of the optimal methods for brokering positive rather than negative and constructive science communications with skeptical publics. So, and with my own work, this work into vaccine hesitancies also has often considered the oblique sort of peripheral ways that audiences are influenced by persuasive variables. Now, look, to start, anti-evolutionism can't be likened to directly likened to resistance to anthropogenic climate change or opposition to vaccines. Even so, despite having differing science, denial contexts, and cohorts, research addressing other science skepticism, I argue, can still reveal important details about decision-making trends as well as what has assisted other science communications efforts and the rhetoric of health and medicine more specifically. So on this account, by integrating leading science intervention findings with my own research, I think I can get closer to making more operational recommendations. Another thing is that, again, while anti-vaccinationism and Darwin skepticism differ in their goals and in their retinue, their counter-vaccine media exhibits a lot of similar characteristics to those identified in pro-evolutionist communications. So I don't have time to discuss in detail the ways that anti-vaccinationist and Darwin skeptic media are similar in terms of their rhetoric, but in broad strokes, we can see analogous sort of persuasion motifs observed across both anti-vaccination and Darwin skeptic mass media, which I present here. So we see a lot of asking questions, rhetorical questions, social consensus. You know, so many people cannot be wrong about not vaccinating their children, or so many people cannot be wrong about opposing evolution. A lot of contrast principle negativity effect in terms of comparing the apparent data that opposes, let's say, vaccines, or opposes, or ostensibly opposes evolutionary theory with that supports it. Source cues. This is a significant thing in both anti-evolutionist and anti-vaccination materials, where there's this constant focus on the apparent credibility of the speakers. Fear appeals, statistics and technical jargon throughout, and especially highlighting shared values. So look, we are the ones that really care about freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And it's the other side that is trying to choke us out. And in relation to highlighting shared values and fear appeals, there's a lot of what we call conspiratist ideation. You know, there's this big kind of conspiracy, academic cabal that is restricting our thought and freedom. So with these resemblances in mind, we're kind of presented with a picture of two different forms of counter-science media exhibiting comparable persuasion attributes and the potential to trigger the contestation of established science. And so then what then, I ask, can we learn from vaccine hesitancy researchers about how to best respond to anti-vaccination influences, bearing in mind the same sort of persuasive attributes as Darwin skeptic mass media? To start, by all accounts, in terms of trying to communicate science to skeptical audiences, trying to frustrate counter-science initiatives and their affiliative attitudes via intensified fact dissemination is unlikely to succeed. All right, so this is the first lesson from anti-vaccination countering research, is that if you just try to increase facts and tell people more about vaccinations and the science behind vaccinations, it's unlikely to do anything positive. So there has been a broad assent that resistance to scientific premises, such as evolutionary theory or vaccines, does not simply occur because of a deficiency of public rationality. Right? And this is many scientists and other academics and science communicators seem to have long accepted that what has been referred to as the information deficit model of science communication, which assumes that people are skeptical of scientific premises because they lack knowledge or scientific literacy. And the deficit model suppositions have traditionally suggested that the solution to erroneous beliefs about science can be found in simply supplying the public with more information, making rather kind of inexplicable science understandable, and giving people the capacity to comprehend scientific fundamentals. And it's kind of been understood or thought that this will result in reciprocative acceptance of scientific ideas. So, look, the public is ignorant. If we just increase facts and disseminate more facts about the science, they'll become more rational and they'll pick it up. But when we look at specifically at vaccine resistance or vaccination resistance, increasing people's factual knowledge and testable understanding about vaccines, for instance, often does not translate into elevated levels of confidence in vaccines or improved immunization behaviors. By contrast, trying to correct misinformation, they've done study after study after study, with accepted scientific facts can often be counterproductive, leading to reductions in people's intentions to vaccinate. So you get cases where you actually sit down people that have expressed vaccine hesitancies, you get a medical doctor to come in and say, look, here is how vaccines work, this is why they're safe, and here's all the science, and people actually leave with lower intentions to vaccinate. And you can actually measure the cognizance. So there have been studies where they said, let's measure people's understanding of vaccines. You can actually get increased understandings of how vaccines work, and then a reciprocal fall in intentions to vaccinate. So in actuality, an individual's understanding of data and theory underlying consensus science is frequently not a reliable indicator of the reception of those same scientific premises. So as a result, when it comes to publicly contested science, such as, again, anthropogenic climate change, biological evolution, or vaccinations, trying to change minds through the intensification of fact communiques is unlikely to produce appreciable results. And so, again, there's been studies where researchers have asked about people's understandings of science, and both, let's say, people that are supportive of anthropogenic climate change and people that are opposed to anthropogenic climate change have equal levels of understanding. So it's not the understanding that's the problem. In fact, with climate change, sometimes people that are opposed to climate change can actually recite the theory behind climate change better than those that are for climate change. And this is because people are liable to make decisions not only on the basis of data and fact claims, but also in relation to persuasive sociocultural influences that are allied to their identity associations and their values and their social cultural interactions. And it's been found that vaccination beliefs and behaviors are driven by an assortment of psychological, socio-political, and cultural considerations in combination with individuals' awareness of data or measures of scientific understanding. So, be that as it may, if increasing data dissemination and science comprehension doesn't really impact vaccination decisions, what approaches to altering vaccination perceptions and behaviors are efficacious for improving immunization acceptance? Are there any pragmatic lessons for research into increasing vaccination uptakes that might be applied or adapted for other counter-science contexts, such as skepticism towards evolutionary theory? So as things stand, again, attempts to modify vaccine beliefs and behaviors provide the immediate lesson that altering people's beliefs and behaviors about contested science seems exceptionally difficult. So not only do facts not work, everything else that's been trialed, much of what has been trialed doesn't seem to work. So most attempts at altering the underlying attitudes and guiding behavior, so around vaccines, for instance, have proven ineffectual, limited in outcomes, or even disadvantageous. So they actually lead to people being less inclined to be vaccinated. And they're frequently designed around sparse amounts of empirical verification. So in reality, there have been few successful evidence-based communication strategies that have positively influenced vaccine beliefs and mitigated opposition to vaccinations. So that's on that positive note. On that positive note, there are some that have some strategies that have demonstrated better results than others. So of the strategies trialed for improving vaccine uptakes, for instance, those that have met with the greatest success and empirical substantiation involve more direct behavioral interventions and delivering improved access to vaccines. So these include providing monetary or non-monetary incentives for vaccinating, imposing penalties, which is what's happened in Australia, for not vaccinating, providing on-site vaccination drives at so coming right to people's places of work, reducing logistical and economic barriers, inhibiting people from getting vaccinated. So that's just, it involves subsidizing travel, for instance, or reducing the cost of getting immunized. Along with that, automatically setting vaccination appointments as the default option for individuals at their local clinic improves vaccination coverage. So such an approach is grounded in the notion of what's called choice architecture or nudging, which includes non-compulsory influences that do not necessarily restrict choices, but instead subtly alter the ways in which the choices are presented. So if you make something opt out, so you're automatically enrolled to get vaccinated by your local doctor, more people just go because it takes too much work to opt out. So if they're automatically opted in and they have to call the doctor and say, oh, I'm not going to come, they're more likely to just go than the other option where you have to opt in to get vaccinated. And so the choice is still there, but the choices are the same. It's just the way that the choices is structured alters people's behavior. Now, look, while these programs may be effective in rallying vaccination uptake, porting them over to Darwin skeptic context is not necessarily straightforward. You can't get enrolled to receive doses of evolutionary theory in an opt-out kind of strategy at your local medical practitioner. So, but that being said, increasing access, choice construction, and behavior modification interventions have demonstrated some of the most operative results in vaccination scenarios. So therefore, I think questions ought to be asked about whether increasing access to pro-evolutionist information or providing incentives or even experimenting with nudging can somehow be used for the advocacy of evolutionary theory in communities expressing science skepticism. Now, along with analysis of behavioral interventions, improving access to vaccines and choice design, numerous studies have identified that healthcare provider recommendations are frequently the key factor in increasing vaccination rates. So, in fact, of all the determinants at play in vaccination choices, one of the strongest predictors of an individual's assent to vaccines is whether their general practitioner delivered positive vaccine advocacy and advice in one-to-one appointment settings. So, that was the largest predictor of whether a person got vaccinated or not, is if their doctor said, look, are you vaccinated? This is why I think you should get vaccinated. And they had one-on-one interactive discussions. Crucially, that observation, I think, does have upshots readily translatable to the evolution skepticism and notions of messenger credibility. So, though doctor-patient relationships are not wholly reflected in religious leader and congregant or participant or devotee interactions, a local cleric's positive recommendations on evolution, I think, may correspondingly serve as a vital influence on a person's receipt of scientific ideas. So that's to say, people unsure about the science of vaccines frequently report that, aside from online searches, so it's actually they go to the internet first, and then they'll ask their doctor. So aside from online searches, their first trusted expert source of information is their local healthcare practitioner. And I think it seems safe to opine that for questions of a religious nature, adherents would likewise turn to the authoritative guidance of their own theological caregivers, taking cues from the religious leaders' perceived expertise on such matters as evolutionary theory. So I venture that, by and large, just as the doctor recommendations are strongly correlated with patient vaccine receipts, so too religious leaders' discourse on evolution would be highly predictive of the views held by congregants with whom the leader has discussed the topic. So a corollary is that if you are a religious mentor supportive of biological evolution's veracity, or you know of such leaders in your midst, face-to-face endorsements from religious protagonists could serve as one of the most effectual ingredients in garnering science acceptance. At the same time, these experts should affirm cultural values. So this is not just religious leaders, but anyone that's trying to promote scientific ideas should affirm cultural values instead of attacking them, and science authorities ought to highlight culturally validating science communications. Additionally, to best avoid values-related polarization, it has been suggested that science communicators employ what's called pluralistic advocacy, and that involves featuring representatives from numerous worldview positions. So look, essentially when science advocacy is delivered by experts from a range of socio-political backgrounds, culturally cognitive polarization tends to diminish because the publicly contested science is no longer associated with any one messenger's group affiliation. So, you can get sort of studies where someone says, look, I want to teach you guys about anthropogenic climate change and why it's a real thing. And I am a Democrat. And as soon as that person says that, everyone in the room who does not identify with being a Democrat then judges that person's credibility as being poor. Even though that person has scientific credibility, maybe has prestigious degrees, as soon as that person demonstrates sociocultural values that differ from them, it tends to nullify the expertise that that person has. So by what one finding is you identify with those people's values, or you present a plurality of views. So you don't just have one person talking about anthropogenic climate change who's a Democrat, you have someone who's a Republican. And if you have two people, then all of a sudden the audience says, oh, more than one type of person can have this view, and it tends to reduce sociocultural, social cognitive polarization. So science advocacy and advocates bearing connections to cultural meanings will be responded to according to those cultural attributes, rather than just the scientific facts being communicated. And so scientists seem to think we can just, often seem to assume, or science communicators seem to assume that we can just increase fact dissemination, but you will be judged not just by the facts, but by the cultural associations that you have as a communicator. So in appreciating that, I say it would be rather inane to assume that, let's say, religious anti-evolutionists might be persuaded to accept evolutionary theory if the biological premise is represented as being fundamentally atheist in nature. And if the advocates themselves are vehemently opposed to any and all religion. Right? You're not, people of a religious leaning will just not accept the theory because it'll be assumed that then evolution is atheistic. In such circumstances, the acceptance of evolution's empirical facts would hinge upon the cultural values thought to be linked with atheism, such that the acceptance of and rejection of polarization would likely splinter between atheists and non-atheists accordingly, regardless of scientific facts. So, aggressively challenging an audience's belief system or central ideologies will only amplify polarization around evolutionary theory or other science, consensus science topics such as vaccinations or anthropogenic climate change. So additionally, some other recommendations include improving the readability. So this is something that's come out with vaccine studies, that pro-vaccine media tends to be much more complex and less readable to general audiences, while anti-vax materials tend to be significantly more readable and salient. Other recommendations including tailoring communications to specific audiences. If you know who you're talking to, then adjust your message to those audiences, which is of course a tried and true marketing adage of know your audience. And another one is targeting fence sitters. So in anti-vax research, they found that targeting ardent and strident anti-vaxxers or anti-vaxxer pundits is completely unsuccessful. And it's also, the majority of the population tends not to be ardent anti-vaxxers, for instance. They tend to be hesitant. And it's much better to target people that are undecided or still deciding rather than those that are completely decided. So look, taking these initial ideas into account for prescriptive ends, as well as some other ideas that I'm going to mention quickly, I've codified these recommendations, translating them into the context of promoting evolutionary theory, and componentized the science communication strategies into three broad categories, which I describe as general guiding principles, proximate interventions, and auxiliary interventions. So general guiding principles, look, discard the information deficit model, account for cultural cognition. Think about the cultural values that people have, enlist local religious leaders, improve the readability of science endorsing materials, again, tailor communications to specific audience, target fence sitters, affirm the autonomy of choice. Always affirm people's ability and their intellect and their intelligence to make their own decisions and their own intellectual freedoms, respect the audience, and this is an interesting one, avoid the familiarity backfire effect. So interestingly enough, they found that when pro-science communicators say, look, you've heard this myth about vaccines, that vaccines cause autism, that MMR causes autism. Here is the truth. Down the line, no one remembers the truth and they only remember the myth, because the myth was more salient. They've heard the myth before. So in repeating the myth, in trying to overthrow it, you're actually making it more salient in people's minds. And some of the research around this is a bit dodgy. But essentially, the idea is that you should try to avoid repeating science skeptical myths because people already know those myths, and by repeating them, they'll remember that myth down the road rather than your opposition to it. But they found that providing warnings before mentioning myths helps. So along with these general guiding principles are proximate interventions, and they include the more direct behavior modification kind of face-to-face techniques. So try nudging, employ incentives where possible, improve people's access to information. Just make it easier for people to get information, and then one-on-one face-to-face mediation. And then we have auxiliary interventions. And these, along with kind of direct strategies, there still remains a need to enhance the ways in which evolution is being communicated, not only in one-to-one settings, but also in persuasive media. So, and mass communications are certainly, almost certainly less operative than proximate science advocacy methods, but because of the practical limitations of behavior modification and face-to-face mediation techniques, there's still a need for using better media communication techniques, and many of these actually coincide with the persuasive cues that I've described throughout my own research. So looking at those peripheral cues. And importantly, these same techniques can also be used to optimize one-on-one interventions, as well as more mass communication. So we get source cues, identify your messenger credibility, social consensus, presumptive announcements, messenger repetition and reminders tend to be very effective. Statistics and technical jargon. So this is the thing, make it more readable, but all the research into vaccines says, but you should still put in some statistics and technical jargon to demonstrate that, look, you're an expert. I say cautious use of the contrast principle negativity effect. Scarcity principle, identify when freedom of information is being restricted or ideas are being censored, because that tends to be quite interesting. And employ narratives. We need to become better storytellers. So for instance, in the anti-vaccination community, narratives are a primary means of communication. So in many respects, this list of auxiliary interventions reflects several of the persuasive devices that are already being used to a much greater degree by a myriad of science skeptic pundits around the globe. So you can choose your science skepticism. You'll see many of these techniques already being used, and I'll end here. So it's on that note that I return to the question regarding what my own research tells us about how to better advocate for consensus science in view of anti-evolutionist influences. And since counter-science commentators are already interfacing with vast global audiences via such instrumental persuasive devices, it seems incumbent upon science communicators to refine the use of the same sorts of strategies in the interest of positively and constructively improving the public reception of things like evolutionary theory. Because when it comes down to how people make decisions about publicly contested science, it's often the case that the way science communications are delivered is as important as their factual bases. Thank you.